Good to see you on, Pam. You are our official note taker, but we need a second one. If we could get a second one, please, then we can go ahead and get started.
Describe just who says what, right? So conversation style, does that work for you?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So can I get a second one? I just posted the link to the notes. Janelle, I hate to pick on you, but when you're not presenting, can you also help?
To speak up. Where did you post that link? I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it right now.
Oh, I posted it on the chat. It is also on your Meet Echo view. It's the little pencil icon, notepad on the top right.
Right here. Thanks.
Yes. So I tried to preload the agenda there. Okay, in the interest of time, if I could get a second one, that would be great, please. We've got a full agenda today, so I want to welcome you to our first official continuation of the Skim working group. The session is being recorded. And why is it not advancing? There we go. Okay, so there may be a few of you who this is the first Skim meeting, so just to provide you the note well, there are some notes to take here with respect to privacy. We will be following the IETF privacy processes as well as the IETF processes, sorry. I'm not going to read them through, but there is the note well to be considered. Okay. Some meeting tips, please stay muted. It is recommended, although for me the headset doesn't work. We usually track attendance through the blue sheet, but now that we're meeting virtually, it's being tracked automatically. There are chat rooms in the Meet Echo. Some of you are already on there. And if you need further assistance, there are a couple of links there to help you. The other thing that was noted that we should highlight is the code of conduct. So a reminder of some of those points here is that as we participate, we should extend respect and courtesy. We all bring in different perspectives. We are a diverse group, so just be respectful of that. Keep our discussions professional and to stay on point. All right, so with that in mind, thank you, Pam, again for being our jabber. We definitely could use a second or third one. It is a live set of notes, so I encourage everyone to help, especially as Pam will be presenting on the third slot. So with that, I want to get to the first order of business, which is to bash the agenda. And I forgot to introduce my co-chair, Barry, who is also with me and will be helping me run the session. Okay, so we have a full agenda. There we go. Hey, Barry. So I'm just gonna spend a few minutes to remind everyone of what we said we would do in the charter. The milestones are there to be as markers, and we can update as we go along. But getting to the agenda. So first up, we've got Janelle and Danny to help provide an introduction of what we did in the first, when Skim first chartered and why we rechartered, meaning they'll go through the current original RFCs with highlights of the new work that we may want to tackle there. That will then be followed by Pam, who will cover the use cases and concepts that we want to focus on now, based on the rechartering. I am hoping Phil will join. I don't see him here, but he is on the dock here to present his current draft on multi-value filtering. And then Danny will be talking about a couple of proposals that he put together in IETF drafts that go to the Skim extensions. And then at the end, I just wanted to cover our next steps and the types of tools that we may want to use. I've got a proposal that I'll put up a couple of polls for how we want to proceed. And that kind of brings us to the end of the session. So with that in mind, any comments or feedback? Going once, going twice? If not, okay, I'm already 1 minute behind. So I know this is an eye chart, but I did put in the link to our actual charter. But again, just to recap, what we agreed to do was to revisit and review and augment to the use cases that will help drive the work that we need to do vis-a-vis updating both the schema and the protocol RFCs, followed by some of the other extensions. So again, I'm not going to read through the charter. This is just to provide you that high level overview. I saw somebody come up on video. So if you want to get on the queue, then I suspect I would like for you to come in and, sorry, I'm not awake yet, to put yourself on the queue through the participants. You don't need to turn your video on. Okay, so with that being said, what we also provided was just a stake in the ground for the kinds of documents that we may want to do besides the revisions to the base schema and protocol. And we just laid out some, what I'm calling markers or milestones of rough targets of where we want to be. That doesn't mean that this is the final thing. It is up to the working group for us to decide how we want to break the work and move forward on things. So, okay, that being said, I left myself with a minute for questions or comments. If not, I know we have a full agenda. So if not, what we can do is move forward to the intro. And we can have Janelle. So Janelle, I figured, and Danny, I could run the slides for you unless you want to, but I just shared them for you.
Welcome, everybody. Nancy, are you ready for Danny and I to take it away? Great.
Please go.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Janelle Allen, and I'd also like to introduce you to Danny Zollner. We both have something in common. We are product managers for Danny's at Microsoft, and I'm at Cisco. Anyway, Nancy, could you flip to the next slide, please? We'd just like to start with what is Skim? You know, this standard has come about over the last 10 years. I think, when did it get released, Danny, the RFC? Do you remember? But Danny?
Bueller? Okay, about 2015, I believe.
Yeah, 2015. And so it's been around for a while. And really, what was it designed to do? It was designed for sharing identity data across contexts, and it really was normalizing this data. Normalizing maybe is a tricky word to use, but it was abstracting away this data from its existing, where it was residing in its data source, to be shared between different organizations' identity context domains, is what we call it in the standard. It consists of a communication protocol and the core schema, and this, it allows for extensibility. It wasn't, a net new standard. It was building upon a lot of work that had come before us in previous ways of deploying and handling identity data. And it was designed to be fast and cheap and easy to use. Nancy, next slide, please. So again, why Skim? It abstracts away this underlying data structure. If the data is stored in a database, such as SQL, or in a directory, such as a LDAP directory or AD or elsewhere, it takes away the notion of that specific data storage mechanism, and it abstracts that away. And it treats every site the same, and that enables scale, and it's very helpful in that way. Nancy, next slide, please. To show you an example, just at a very, very conceptual level, we have an example of an identity here. Her name is Jane Smith, and her data is stored in a database. We don't go into great details of the database. This is a suggestion. The format of that data might be stored with the last underscore name, Jane Smith. But this example is showing that there's a service, a Skim service, that's sharing that data, to an app that's running in the cloud, somewhere. And that app wants to store that same user in a different data structure, and the data structure being suggested here is a directory structure. And we can see that the Skim service transforms the data from its original data store into this standardized JSON format that Skim takes the data through. And then the client can decide how to interpret that data and then store it on the other side. Next slide, please. The Skim protocol is defined in RFC 7644, and it had a RESTful approach and design. And it's a set of APIs. They follow, they use the HTTP methods, the verbs for get, post, push, patch, and delete, which is very convenient for identity data, which follows, the create, read, update, and delete methods. So we can map those quite easily to these HTTP methods. And, we can send the standard Skim JSON payloads to the resource endpoints, which can be users, groups as defined in the standard, and other resources which are definable by the standard. It standardizes these methods for communication with the servers. In Skim, these servers are called service providers. And what is a service provider in essentiality? It's an HTTP server which exposes standard Skim APIs for the traditional create, read, update, and delete operations for a Skim client. All of the endpoints provide, there are 3 endpoints, I should say, that provide discoverability for understanding how to interact with the server or the Skim providers. And Danny will take over the next slides.
Hi. So Yeah, we wanted to go over just what are the standard endpoints included in the original Skim 2.0 spec. So up at the top of the list, we've got /users and /groups. Those represent, shockingly, users and groups, which are mainstays of identity, really, regardless of how you're where the identity data is stored. Those endpoints allow for sort of the full gamut of the REST verbs: get, post, put, patch, and delete. And both, I guess, users and groups, they come with a core set of attributes, and then the users also have in their schema, there is an enterprise schema that is an extension of a couple extra attributes that is included in the Skim 2.0 standard. Groups has a simpler schema compared to users. The only group-specific attributes that aren't part of a common pool would be display name and members. But part of our charter is to look into that and make it expanded. There's next down the list, we have /me. /me is a method defined in the standard to allow an authenticated user to read data about themselves or interact with themselves. So, examples being maybe you've got some internal application and it's going to update, it's going to allow the user to update their password using the Skim standard. So they can send a post or a patch or whatnot to, well, probably not a post, because how are you going to create yourself? But it allows them to manipulate themselves specifically. Next on the list, we have 3 that all have that check mark next to them. And these are what we refer to as the discovery endpoints. So /schemas allows you to retrieve available schemas. And the schemas are just representations of a set of available attributes for a resource type. So the user's resource has 2 schemas, the core and the enterprise. Groups just has core. And it's very extensible. Moving on to the next one, resource types. That's a way to discover what resources are available. So in the core standard implementation, resource types would return users and groups. And then service provider config allows you to read configuration details specific to that Skim server or service provider, such as it is such and such feature enabled, and if it is, what are the parameters of it. So there's a handful of like configuration options defined in the core schema, but some of the draft extensions that have been written also, they all propose using service provider config to advertise whether or not they are implemented on the service provider. And down at the bottom of the list, we have 2 that are I think a little less frequently implemented, but I've seen instances of both, I believe, bulk especially. So there's .search, which you would, it's essentially an alternative to the HTTP GET REST method. It allows you to define a query and you submit that query using post in order to receive a set of results. And then the bulk endpoint, you'll submit your request using a post, and inside of the body of that request will be 1 or more separated sets of actions. So you'll include not only the resource that you're hitting, but also the REST method and the body of that request. So it allows you to sort of scale and hit efficiency more easily, because you can submit 20 or 100 or higher amounts of a combination of get, post, patch, put, delete.
So Danny and Janelle, I don't know if you're taking questions in the middle, but Phil Hunt is in the queue. He might have a
Sure.
comment.
Go ahead, Phil.
Phil? Phil, you're in the queue. Did you have a comment or question?
I saw his microphone thing light up.
Okay, just keep going, Danny. I'll ping Phil.
Okay. Yeah, he's having mic problems. Next slide, please. And then on this page, we have a not exhaustive. Okay, so Phil had a comment. The post on .search is for security because a get query can reveal PII. Okay, so yeah, I did not have the context on that, so that is very much appreciated. And to expand on that, we can actually use what we have right here on this slide to go into the details of that. So on this slide, we have a set of examples, not exhaustive, obviously, of things that can be done with the Skim protocol. So the third example, we'll just jump straight to that. In the resource URL, so https:// whatever /users filter equals, you can see there we're saying users filter equals username equals user@domain.com. And so the post.search option allows to perform a search without having sort of a plain text URL with PII in it. So now rewinding a little bit, we'll just talk through some of the other ones. So a post against /users will let you create a new resource. And this is, I'm using users as the examples for all of these, but this scales out to any data resource representing objects that can be manipulated. So if you send a post with a body containing adequate information to /users, /groups, /anything, assuming it's been implemented in the relevant Skim server, you should be able to create a resource. Get against the root resource like /users will return all resources. Then the third example, you can define attribute-based filters. They can be fairly simple like this, or they can be multiple sets in parentheses. You have a full set of operators and/or you can only return users where department equals sales, or they match a specific username. And then we also have another method of retrieving a user that doesn't use a filter, which is the fourth line, and that would just be getting them using their ID value, which is a sort of a core component of Skim, and that will return just the resource matching that ID value. And the standard states that ID needs to be unique across all resources. Next two are two different methods to update objects. So if you do a put on a resource, you will define the full set of attribute values that it has. And if you omit anything, it is expected that the attributes that have been omitted will be set to null or blank. And then patch allows you to do a selective set of modifications without clobbering all of the other things. So if you send a patch for a user and only modify active from true to false, you're leaving all of the other information away, or alone rather, and not modifying it. Another option for updating, you can actually use filters to select a group of objects or resources and update all of them based, anything that comes back on the filter will get the same update applied. So if you need to change the name of the department, sales gets turned into, the organizational rebranding or whatever, you can do that at scale pretty easily. And then delete, self-explanatory, allows you to delete the resource. Next slide, please. So now to talk about the schema a little more. So the schema defines a minimal common set of attributes that represent the user and group data along with the enterprise extension. We talked about this. It's also very extensible. So you can extend schemas. You can add existing or you can add attributes to existing resource types. Users, groups, but you can also extend resource types. So if the content, if the concepts of users and groups aren't adequate for the usage situation, your service provider can implement others, and they can be advertised with that /resource types endpoint that we discussed a few slides ago. So it may be /contacts, conference rooms, but the sky's the limit essentially. And then the Skim standard says that custom schemas may be permanently registered with IANA. From our research, we're not actually sure if anybody has done this yet, although there are plenty of custom schemas out there. So far, the only ones that we were able to notice there were the ones directly assigned to the standard. Next slide, please. And so now we wanted to take sort of a little snippet of the RFC and show how it's represented in the body of an object in Skim format. So the Skim schema RFC, which is 7643, has two different spots where it describes attributes. The first section, which is it's either in the section 3 or 4. Sorry, I can't remember. Is a more descriptive manner of talking about attributes, and that's what we see on the left. And so it's a short set of 1 or 2 sentences per attribute, sometimes longer, talking about the properties that it has. And then down in, I believe it's section 8, there's a full JSON representation of the schema that's shown, and that gives you all of the nitty gritty. The mutability state, is it read only, is it read write, is it multi-valued, what's the data type, all those things. And in the current standard, there's been a couple instances where some confusion gets drawn between the two sections, the sort of expository description part versus the JSON representation. But that's something we're hoping to touch on moving forward. But on this slide, we can see name is described as a single valued complex attribute. It's the components of a user's name. And then if we look over on the right in that section of name, we can see its name and then the squiggly brackets, which are indicative that it's a complex attribute. And a complex attribute is then made up of 1 or more simple valued attributes. So that could be, string, integer, whatnot, Boolean. So name has several sub attributes: formatted, family name, given name. And then, phone numbers is similar, except it's a multi-valued complex attribute. And we can tell that because it's the square brackets, and then it'll be 1 or more sets of squiggly brackets, each set of squiggly brackets enclosing a single complex result or object of that value. I guess a complex value would be the right word. And we can see phone numbers in this representation has value and type. I believe there's 1 or 2 other sub attributes as well. And same thing for emails. It's multi-valued complex, so it's an array of 1 or more complex values. Typically, with the type value is used to differentiate between different purposes for email. Because if you have more than 1 email, it may be that one is a personal email or a secondary versus a primary work-related one. Certain attributes in the schema, such as username, are required. ID is also required. And then there's whenever results are retrieved from a server, there are also some attributes that are returned back that are read-only. So there's this whole complex meta attribute with some metadata about the object. And then you can see up at the top, the schemas returned tells what schemas are being used for this object. So we can see in this example, the core 2.0 user schema and the extension enterprise 2.0 user, which are the 2 different user schemas in the standard. Next slide, please. And here's just a quick list of the data types. You got sort of your old favorites: strings, booleans, decimal, integer, date, time, binary, and then the 2 that are worth talking about a little bit here are reference and complex. Complex, we just saw a couple examples of. Again, it's just a collection of 1 or more simple valued attributes grouped together. And then reference is a pointer to a resource somewhere. So, for example, the standard defines an attribute for photos for like a profile picture type concept, and a URL will be included. HTTPS : whatever .jpg. And so the reference attribute is a reference to a URI pointing to a resource. And with that, next slide, please, and back to Janelle.
Skim has been widely successful. It's been widely adopted by many companies around the world. It's why we are here is that there have been some wrinkles in Skim, and we seek to address them. And some of these are related to usability. Sometimes the spec isn't 100% clear in certain areas, and this leads to some interoperability challenges. And then you may have a client side Skim client, that customer that's interacting with the server, and they come into, well, having arguments over how they're implementing the spec, and then they realize that actually it's not clear sometimes in the spec. There is limited guidance on certain aspects, such as groups and roles, how you handle entitlements. And some of the attributes are not clearly defined in 7643. So we seek to improve the usability of the spec in general. We are looking to make improvements. Some companies have noticed some problems with the bulk operations and how they operate. Pagination has some limitations. Some people would like to extend the core schema. And then, there are some new and emerging concepts that have been in draft that are actually in use in draft, such as limited privileged access management. We seek to move that from draft to standardize and address whatever issues it has. So these are the types of paper cuts. The paper cuts we have a link to, and we welcome other organizations to share their experiences with Skim as well, and share that with the working group so we can address any other issues that may not have been already documented in the paper cuts. Nancy, next slide, please. So what are our goals for the next generation of Skim? And really, we seek to improve these overall best practices and guidances and clearing up the specification in areas of ambiguity. There is some notion of that had been in previous drafts regarding soft delete and how to handle that in Skim as well. And then also looking to enhance the schema in certain areas for data that's handled by HR systems, enterprise group data, as well as privileged access management. Advanced automation scenarios, there are several of those that we could wax and wane on for quite some time. And then enhanced data handling for larger sets. This could be the pagination, this could be other things. These are some of our goals. You can read the full list in our charter of what we're seeking to do in the link below, Nancy shared as well. Thanks, everybody. Are there any questions?
Yeah, you're doing great on time.
Well, Nancy, it seems that we can move on to the next agenda person, and then there'll be more time and questions on something meatier than the intro.
How we can proceed. Well, I mean, at some point, the group will need to decide on the content of how we want to go about updating both the schema and the protocol specs, right? But in the meantime, yes, we can move on to Pam.
All right. Given we've had some mic issues, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine. I can see you fine. That's awesome.
Great.
And I just shared your slides.
Perfect. And you're willing to play slide advancer for me?
Of course.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you for all your work. We really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. My name is Pam Dingle. I work for Microsoft as well. I get to work with Danny. And what we want to cover today is, in fact, we want to dig more into RFC 7642. If you haven't heard of 7642, I wouldn't be terribly surprised. If you want to advance to the next spec. So there are actually 3 specifications that were published as a family in that 2015 timeframe. 7643 and 44 were the core schema and the core protocol. This document, 7642, has the title of Definitions, Overview, Concepts, and Requirements. So it's a to use what I think is the right spec terms, it's a non-normative document. It doesn't exactly instruct you how to use things, but it is meant to, the goal of it, as I understand it, is for someone to be able to read this and then have an easier time understanding what to do with the actual core specifications. Does anyone want to add any color around the creation of 7642 now? I know we have a few people who are there for the actual process.
It's too bad Phil has mic problems because
I know, right?
He was there from the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that means that I can, take his name in vain for the next 30 minutes, and there's really nothing to do. Okay, don't put that in the scribing. All right. So what we want to do today is just look at what the fit for purpose has been for 7642. And at the end of it, my goal here is to ask whether people have interest in participating in an effort to revise this document. So just keep that in mind as we speak. Informational status. Sorry, Roman in the chat added the official correct terms. So it is an informational status versus a proposed standard, which is what 7643 and 44 are. Okay, great. So let's dig then into what does 7642 talk about. So one of the major things that 7642 talks about is it tries to create the names of actors that have relationships to each other in the Skim specification, or that could comprise use cases that use the Skim specification. And so they describe 3 different actors: a cloud service provider, an enterprise cloud subscriber, and a cloud service user. Now, this, of course, is now slightly dated terminology in that, a lot of the implications in the document are that enterprise cloud subscribers always have certain patterns of usage. And I think those patterns of usage are slightly, have proven to not pass the test of time. But essentially what you're seeing here, this sort of the diagram that's been provided is this idea of a cloud service provider as essentially a multi-tenant platform with many ECSs or enterprise cloud subscribers subscribing. And then in turn, those enterprise cloud subscribers have users attached. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there is no exact correlation here to a subscriber versus a provider in the actual 7643 and 44 language. So the word subscriber is not a term in the protocol at all, as far as I know. It's certainly not in the definitions in RFC 7643. And so there's some confusion and ambiguity here. Now, the other thing is that the cloud service provider, the term service provider is in fact an important term in 7643. But as you'll see as we go on, there are times when cloud service providers talk to cloud service providers. And in that case, the term service provider has 0 protocol specific meaning. And so we have a collision in terms, just in the basic terminology that's used in 7642. Let's keep going if you want to advance this. So here's where the real confusion comes in. So we define in 7642 triggers, modes, and use cases. So the triggers are sort of the major obvious triggers that would happen in a RESTful a RESTful service endpoint, right? Creation, update, deletion. And then there's a trigger called single sign-on, which is an interesting one. So it's really meant, I think, to talk about just-in-time use cases. But the interesting thing nowadays is that just-in-time use cases occur for reasons other than just SSO. They occur for things like privilege elevation, for example. And so that term is slightly outdated now as well. It was perfectly fine in the day, at least in my opinion. And by the way, I'm making what might be provocative statements in the hopes that you care to correct me. So, if you feel like I'm being overblown here, I would love to hear it. And I'm doing so kind of on purpose to see if I can enrage you all enough to come join me in making this work. So you can see the use cases in the document. For example, we have a ton of these cloud service provider to cloud service provider interactions. That's perfectly fine. We certainly have cloud service provider interactions today in 2021. However, what the document doesn't do today is translate the use case of a cloud service provider trying to create an identity at another cloud service provider with any kind of protocol terms. So, we really get is this very coarse understanding that data is being pushed from one cloud service provider to another. And I think all of us here can agree that for someone to really understand how Skim works, they have to understand more nuance than that, right? The data flow, the direction of data flow is important, but there are a ton of concepts that an actual implementer of the specification has to understand. And we'll go through some of those concepts a little bit farther along. But the big one here is the confusion over service provider, because in 7643, service provider is generally defined as being an entity that runs a service endpoint, the RESTful endpoint, right? And a client is defined as the entity that is accessing that endpoint. And so, when you talk about pushes and pulls, there's an implication here that it's the client pushing to the service provider or the client pulling from the service provider, but none of that is explicitly defined. It's left sort of for the reader to peruse both. You really have to read all three documents before you can come to any conclusions, which I believe makes this document slightly less useful. The next question is, again, with subscriber, is a subscriber a client? We don't know. We don't think so. Just based on this list, if you look at it, if an ECS is pushing to a CSP, then great. The ECS would likely be the client, and the CSP would likely be the service provider. But what about the other options? What if we want the opposite to happen, right? What if we want the ECS to be the service provider and the CSP to be the client? Those things are also possible, and they're not described here. Just stopping. Anyone want to comment on these use cases? Has anyone had experience in reading this doc? I'm guessing people don't, because I don't think it's a useful aid at this time. And so we're sort of in this situation where no one's read it. No one knows it exists. And hopefully people will feel the need to be able to come help me improve it. If you want to go ahead, Nancy. So here's the other question to contemplate, right? How has identity management changed in the 10 years since 7642 was started and where we are now? And how many of those concepts are actually important for implementers as they look at the Skim specification? So, you look at the SSO trigger as an example of how the world has changed, right? Privileged access management is now in 2021 an absolutely critical part of most enterprise security regimes, governance regimes, and that idea of a real-time ability to quickly create an account. It existed in 2011, but it existed primarily as a federation concept where, you know, when you arrive at a relying party, the relying party would take the data from us from an SSO assertion and push it into a database, right? Create the user on demand at that time. There's a whole bunch of on-demand capabilities and use cases that exist now. You know, we have a ton of workflow around privilege elevation that's super important as well. So, you know, cross-domain, you know, not just access, but elevation. Those two concepts are one example of this. Another interesting thing to note, and this is more to 76, 43, and 44, is that webhooks didn't exist, as I understand it. They did not exist before Skim was created. So, you know, do we have to think about those kinds of, you know, industry changes that have occurred around us? Proof of possession is another example. You know, we have some basic requirements right now in 76, 43, and 44 around OAuth, but we don't have like strong security recommendations for Skim because those didn't exist. We didn't have things like Depop at the time that this document was being created. And so the question then becomes, are these kinds of concepts and use cases things that we do want a Skim implementer to be aware of? You know, we have a lot of issues right now with folks taking what I would call the hello world path to implementing specifications, where they implement it until it succeeds, right? They implement it until the user gains access. But what they don't do is check whether users that shouldn't have access don't. And, you know, this is a big problem industry-wide, in my opinion. And it's something that we should be more, what's the word? We should be better able to advise now, especially as folks who are writing clients are trying to understand the bounds of what they should implement. Does anyone else have a list, or is there anything others would want to bring up around, you know, changes in the way identity management has changed? The other one that I want to bring up here is maybe the simplest one, which is in 2011, it was almost a given that enterprises on premises would be the heart of any kind of provisioning regime. I don't know if anyone wants to challenge me on that, but having been there myself, that's my, you know, that's my memory, right? Was that people loved the cloud in limited doses, and really never thought that an entire cloud native regime was anywhere near coming true. But here we are 10 years down the line. And so the idea of a pure cloud native enterprise is starting to be true. There are cloud native enterprises today. And so that idea of, you know, every cloud element is trying to now negotiate their service providerness versus their clientness. That stuff is all just changing,
so Pam,
right? Changing. Yep.
You have Janelle in the queue. She might want to comment as well. Yep.
Excellent.
Go ahead, Janelle.
Yeah, Pam, just to add on to some of your observations in the last 10 years and how identity has changed. I think when we were looking at Skim back then, it was really between, you know, maybe, you know, within an organization to another organization, but not this kind of explosion of the propagation of the cloud and all the service providers that are out there and all the funnels of all the data that's floating around. And so I think that there's kind of a narrow view, just really based on the existing implementations of how people were implementing locally within their organizations, say provisioning services or identity services for their enterprise, but then that expanded reach now globally. I think there were notions of how that might work, but we didn't have that practical experience as we do now.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And, you know, probably the last big change is that governance has become a security imperative. And that, you know, I would say in 2011, governance was primarily an accounting measure. You know, you would count all your users, you would make sure you had the right users. You might sign a quarterly affidavit And what we're seeing now is this huge push for real-time understanding of who has access to what system. And, you know, with an expectation that if attackers are in the system, there is a detection that can occur and a remediation that can occur. So instead of every quarter looking at your user list for a financial resource and saying, hey, John Smith is dead, we should really remove him, right? We're now in a situation where attackers are, you know, gaining access, creating a user with administrative privileges, executing 5 commands, deleting that user. And those kinds of activities now make provisioning far, far more important, right? It's not just a case now of having to deal with users who might get terminated and then try to sabotage the company. You're really looking at using provisioning, using user an understanding of who's in what systems to keep the entire company safe. All right, so if you want to go ahead. So what 7642 doesn't do today, which I think it should, is it should talk about how clients today implement bidirectionality. Because the truth is there is, you know, we're not purely pushing and we're not purely pulling in almost every circumstance. We are, you know, generally speaking, there's a flow, a data flow, right? Where we are, you know, the creation of accounts occur in one direction. And it may occur from Skim client to Skim provider, or it may occur from service, from, you know, from the, you know, the flow may run from service provider to Skim client, but the Skim, it's because the Skim client is pulling data. So understanding this diagram to me is a big part of what we can do with 7642, right? If you think about how a push-pull works when the data flow is moving from Skim client to Skim to service provider, generally speaking, what it means is the Skim client is making those create, delete, you know, patch, post, or patch, pull, you know, put types of commands, but they're also using get commands constantly, right? To make sure that they have the right idea of what the service provider knows, to be able to check whether an incremental push is even needed, right? So it isn't just a case of the data flow. It's a case of the Skim client having to be sophisticated enough to know what it can search for, when to make for, to make their queries efficient. So, you know, giving a better, more nuanced view to folks who want to be a Skim client and who want to be able to update service providers would be very, very useful. If you look at the second piece down here, in the same way, if you are a Skim client who has to pull data from a service provider, there may absolutely be pushes that occur. And that is, you know, that comes to this idea of multiple starts of authority, which I think is another place where in the last 10 years, we've gotten a lot more sophisticated. So it's absolutely possible, for example, in an HR system, that the HR system is the service provider, that, you know, a cloud platform might be pulling data from the service provider and might even be responsible for the existence of the user, but is going to push back and, you know, is going to play the authority for an email address, for example. And so, you know, so it just isn't as simplistic now as it might have used to be. And so we absolutely have to understand how the user is moving, right? How the accounts are being created through the system. But we need to give more nuanced advice on how, you know, how a, you know, a user with a specific business goal can actually deploy these tools. All right, if you want to go to the next one. So the two patterns you see here combine, right? And this is the other piece that is not addressed in 7642. You end up with these chains of provisioning where, you know, you might have a cloud platform in the middle, right, as a service provider, and you might have clients looking to both push and pull data. So, you know, in this case, another, you know, this could be Workday on the left-hand side, and it could be Salesforce on the right-hand side, and it could be Google in the middle, as an example. So understanding where you are in this hierarchy and, you know, related to your start of authority becomes important, because it changes, you know, just because you're a client attaching to a service provider does not mean that's enough data. for you to understand what you should do next. And, you know, this is also where the pagination and synchronization discussions come in. We have given, you know, there's no guidance at all for folks as to how they should be thinking about reconciling data, keeping data in sync. And I think we can better prepare our users in this case. I'm just going to do a quick time check, Nancy. Do you want me to be done by 5 a.m.
Yeah,
my
I
time?
mean,
Or by...
you have 15 more minutes.
Okay, all right. Great.
And
I
you
thought
can
so. I
thank
just wanted to
Janelle
make sure.
and Dan, Janelle and Danny for that. But yeah,
Right.
you have 15 minutes left.
Okay, cool. All right, so in that case, so in this case, I've defined this term of provisioning hub. I don't know that this is the right term. It's not a term that's used in the specifications today. But you know, if it's the case that we want these kinds of relationships to be communicated, then I think terms like provisioning hub might be more valuable, right? That show that data is, you know, sort of ingressing and egressing, so to speak, compared to talking about a cloud service provider, because essentially everyone's a cloud service provider today. So it's not super valuable to call them that. You know, I'm open, obviously, you know, we can propose any set of terms we want, but I do believe that some terms to help understand the difference here are important. And so, you know, if you're for example, if you're an implementer who is, you know, who has a SaaS application and wants to be able to pull data from, let's say, you know, 3 major cloud service platforms, right? Pick any 3. They may actually have to, you know, they may not be able to play the client in all 3 situations. And so having them understand that and understand that they're essentially the, you know, the final stop on a train is super valuable. If you want to go to the next slide, right? This is one common pattern, right? Where the service provider is the provisioning hub. The second common pattern is the case where the Skim client is a provisioning hub. And in case you think that there are no examples of this in the wild, Microsoft Azure is an example of this pattern, right? Whereas I believe that Amazon and Google are both examples of the service provider pattern. So in this case, you know, you know, if you're that same person, that same implementer trying to set up your SaaS app to receive data, you're going to have to implement an endpoint versus implementing a client, right? And ultimately, the decision you make there depends a ton on what your downstream partner already has set up. And that's, I think, a useful thing to also communicate here. And again, it has to be bidirectional, right? The pattern that was brought up in this case of, you know, if you're on the right-hand side here as the service provider on the right, is that you may be absolutely, oh, I just realized my arrows are backwards. But anyways, you may be pulling data from that, or the Skim data, you know, the Skim client is going to be looking at you all the time, right? In order to push data to you, because they're going to be looking at whether they need to push in the first place, right? So those patterns of push-pull become more and more important for implementers to understand. I got a comment in the chat. Since Skim is an HTTP protocol, the terms all originate from HTTP. Yes, that's fair enough. But I do think that an overlay in this case is useful. I don't know if there isn't really a concept of chaining. I don't think, right, on the HTTP front. If there is, let me know. We can always adopt it. All right. So let's look at, yes, perfect. Thanks, Nancy. So again, these things compose, right? So the chains start to compose as well. And we start to get maps of how account creations, right, and account updates ripple through a company, right, or through a system, or, you know, through a network. And so what you can see here is I've got notation to denote where the start of authority is. So in this case, the top left Skim client is sort of the origination of the account. And as you know, the Skim client there pushes to the service provider, what happens is you may have a provisioning hub that in fact can handle both service provider and Skim client operations, right? So in this case, you've got a full fan out effect. right? So data gets pushed from the original Skim client into the service provider. And then what's happening is some clients are pulling that data in order for them to be updated. But the cloud platform may also be pushing that data to other service providers, right? So now you've got a full-on ecosystem of pushes and pulls and ripples of data. The one thing to note here is if the service provider on the bottom left, although it's drawn with a data flow that implies that it's a downstream application, it's not, right? If you look at the pattern for that service provider is identical to the pattern for the service provider on the right. So essentially, the patterns start to collapse at some point, right? Depending on the direction, and the directions matter far more about where this big dotted line is than about any kind of overall direction, right? Things start to blend. And if you go to the next one, so that's one case, the case where the Skim client is kicking off the avalanche. The second use case is where the service provider is kicking off the avalanche, right? So a database gets updated, the data passively sits at the service provider waiting, and the cloud platform as the client then actively goes and pulls that data from the service provider and kicks off the whole ripple effect again, right? Whether there are entities passively fetching or entities that are actively being pushed to. So to me, this is this understanding of how all of it works, right? Is this much more complex set of pulls and pushes are far more important than just understanding there's such a thing as an overall push or an overall pull. All right, you want to hit the next one, and we're getting to the end here. So then the question becomes, what can we do, right? What should we do? We don't have to write an entire opus on how Skim works, right? So I think what we want is a minimal amount of data that is going to make it easier to read the specification, right? And so for me, there's some basics here. First of all, we have to align the taxonomy. We have to talk about service providers and clients in ways that are helpful to understand how they work in the specification. This, as it exists today, 7642 never talks about service providers or clients, never talks about resources or resource types. It never talks about extensibility. It never uses the term provisioning domain, which is defined in 7643. None of that is even in the document, and I think that's something we can address. And then, from a use case perspective, now we have much more nuanced use cases that we can discuss, right? We can discuss, for example, the 7642 doesn't talk about groups at all. It literally only talks about users, right? So just that, you think of the difficulty that exists in understanding what to do with large groups, right? Million user or million member groups. Talking about those use cases, I think, can be very, very helpful. Have people understand what they need, right? The /me endpoint is never discussed. Search is never discussed. So, some number of things, we don't have to exhaustively drain it, but finding the set of use cases that actually give people the whole picture of the specification is valuable. Setting up custom resources, for example, would be a very good use case in my opinion. And then there are some of these more advanced concepts, which we can decide whether to include or not. The idea of incremental attribute exchange, never discussed, and that's super useful. Like put and post to read the spec and understand the difference between a put and a patch is pretty hard work, but we could very easily make it better with a use case that describes it. And then, of course, synchronization is the other one. That's a heavily discussed part of this new Skim 3.0 world. So let's see. Oh, Phil, you've got a comment in the chat about looking at things from an information perspective. I would love to know what you're thinking there. If you want to jump on the queue, please do. And then,
I think that comment, yeah. Pam, that comment was well before.
Oh, was it? Okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see it soon enough.
No, that's fine.
Sorry, Phil. If you do want to come on and make a comment, we of course would love it. But at the end of the day, here's what I think we need, right? We need something that's easy to read, and that is going to be time well spent for anyone who takes the time to look at it. And then something that in fact is going to change how people read the specification in a positive way, right? And then the last thing is just to make sure that there is nuance that that can be gleaned out of this document that helps them understand complexities as they look at the spec. And I think that's it. I will leave it there. Hopefully this is useful for folks, but I would like to ask for volunteers. So, you know, I am committed to trying to put a draft together as soon as I can and submit it to this working group for consideration. Is, you know, if there's anyone who's interested in being part of this, you can respond on the email list. I'm assuming you could contact Nancy or Barry. You can speak up now. Anything like that would be greatly appreciated. Oh, Phil can't make comments. He still has no audio.
Well, so this is a little disconcerting. So Phil, if you have no audio, Pam, you've got 4 minutes left. So if anybody has comments or feedback or additions or a different perspective to what Pam presented, we can discuss it in the next 4 minutes. Pam, you have a volunteer in Janelle.
Yes, that's
she
fantastic.
just put on the chat. She's happy
excited
to join you. So next on the agenda, Phil, if you have no audio, you had mentioned that there was potentially somebody else who could also present. Yeah, I couldn't remember his name, so.
There isn't a way we can call Phil in or anything like that, is there, with Meet Echo?
Greg Wilson. Yeah, Alessandra, I don't know if you have any other suggestions to have Phil be able to present, because he's up next.
We could try getting me on the phone with Phil and seeing if it will play through my microphone. Let me see if that can work.
Okay. Thanks, Barry. So Pam, I think this is a really good start at the modernization. It looks like you're introducing some new terms as well that could help help provide a guide, I guess, as we modernize the protocols as well.
Yeah, I'm hoping too for guidance. I mean, I think what we can do now is revise this use cases and definitions document to point to the current Skim document so that they're a pair. And then in theory, there's a possible revision that has to happen at the point where 7643 and 44 are subtly changed, right? If we decide to subtly change them, right? So I feel like this work, there will be an initial piece of work to align to existing Skim 2.0 specs, and then a follow-up addendum possibly, prior to us trying to go to any kind of, get any kind of RFC number to be sure that nothing's changed out from under us.
Okay. Well, I suspect that, once you put a proposed draft in place, we can evolve it over time.
Perfect.
Typically, yeah, in the other working groups, the use cases help guide how we shape the updates to both the schema and the protocol as well, and potentially other drafts as well.
That makes sense. I think what the group can do in general is also keep us from boiling the ocean, right? There's definitely a line that has to be drawn as to what's useful for people to know and what's too much information. So I think that'll be the,
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry,
that'll
I
be the
forgot to
system.
project your last slide.
That's right. And it was
Yeah.
so pretty.
Well, my bad. But literally anyone is free. Hey, I see Phil.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Awesome. And we are in perfect timing.
Browser number 4.
Okay. I presume I should go ahead and share your slides now. So thank you, Pam. And so just to close on the use cases, you can also contact Pam directly as she's volunteering to put the proposal for updating the use cases draft. Feel free to contact me as well, but also as she is taking on the pen, feel free to contact her directly to get more involved. Okay, with that, Phil, so happy you are now on.
I can't tell you how horrified I was. I'm sorry for all the messing around here.
Yeah,
Um,
Danny was kind of sweating too because he was volunteering, as a last resort. So glad to
yes.
have you on.
Apparently Safari latest doesn't work, and Firefox isn't even talking with my OS, so
Oh,
who knows?
joy.
So Chrome's working. Okay. Yeah, so this draft came out essentially after Skim was published. And the problem that came up was that initially, when you have very large groups, sometimes you just want a sample of the data. And the idea was, hey, Phil, how can we page multi-value attributes? And I was a little confused, and I noticed people on the email list are confused. We want to page the values, or say I want a range of values by index, rather than paging resources, which is the normal what the Skim protocol does. It lets you page through a set of resources that might be returned from a query. In this case, the intent is I want to select a set of rows from a multi-value attribute to return. So this spec provides 2 types of ways to select those values, either by filter or by index, essentially. And to help avoid some confusion, I've changed the name to multi-value filtering because this spec kept getting rolled up into the stateful page discussion, which really is a separate thing. So I think we can go to the next slide. So this draft was submitted after the group finished its charter, and that's why it sat around for a few years. Really hasn't had any discussion. So in Skim, when we have a filter, we have something called a value, I believe it's called a value path. And really what it is normally you might say emails equals phil.hunt@yahoo.com. But really what you're trying to say is if you want a way to say if the emails.type equals work and emails.value ends with yahoo.com, I want to return the value. And we introduced in the Skim protocol spec the value path notation, which is to put square brackets after an attribute so that you could execute the filter within the context of that complex multi-valued attribute. So I can say emails square bracket type equals work and value ends with yahoo.com, would select a particular row from that attribute. And the thinking here was, why don't we use that notation on the attributes list so that I can tell Skim that when it returns that attribute, I just want a particular row of data or a particular sub-attribute of data from that table. Table. It's from that JSON object that we have. The We also then thought, as well as doing a value path filter, we want to do ranging, much like we do with paging. So we just use the start index and count parameters to specify if I'm got a group with 1 million members and I just want the first page of data, I can say start index is 1, but I only want 10 rows. And that saves a lot of data being returned unnecessarily. So the extension defines this, and it also defines 2 more things. The first question that came up in the discussion we did have is, how do I know how many values are available? The first time you execute this query, the service provider can add a meta attribute, meta.attribute.count, to indicate what the number of rows are for that attribute. You can decide, my thinking is it would be returned only when you invoke this type of request, but that we can discuss. I don't know that you need to add it for every single request that comes in. We'll see the example request coming up. Because this is going to be an enhancement to Skim and it's its own RFC, then you need some method to know, has the server implemented this RFC? So we describe a discovery parameter in the service provider config as well in the spec. So next slide. So this would be a GET request. And in this case, the parameter attributes is normally used to say, this is the list of attributes that I want returned. But what we're doing is we're saying I want asterisk, which is I want all the attributes, but for emails, I only want the rows where type equals work. So that would be the GET request. Go to the next slide. And you can see that emails is returned, and there's only one value returned, and it's the one that corresponds to type equals work as requested. And the emails.count, this is probably a bad example. I should have said 2 or more, because the example would be that assumes that there's 2 or 3 email addresses, and the count would reflect the number of actual email addresses available, so that the client knows that there is more. That's not meant to reflect the count of items returned. That wouldn't be that useful. So bad example on my part, but the intent here is that emails.count would indicate the number of values that are actually available. So next slide. So if I wanted to do multi-value paging, and as I mentioned, the term might not be the best because we're confusing it with results paging. In this case, we're doing members type equals group and count equals 5 and start index is 1. So if I had a type of group, in other words, a group within a group, I want to know the first 5 members where the type equals group, and we return that value. So I don't have an example for this, but that would be how you would specify a range in this case. And it just follows the same pattern we've used for resource paging, we can now use in the attributes parameter. Next slide. So the spec is fairly straightforward. Some things to clean up is whether you want to have that count of values that are actually available. I have to update and revise security and privacy considerations because privacy considerations is now a new thing. So of course those have to be added, and so if it became a working group document, I would actually put that in as the in the draft as it gets adopted. I do, however, think it's since you're further restricting information within the Skim protocol spec, you're actually narrowing the exposure information. So I do think that these will be relatively straightforward and they'll follow the same security and privacy considerations that RFC 7644 has. We're not introducing any new exposures here.
Pam, you're in the
And
queue.
Question: when you say awaiting tentative agreement on extension mechanism, is that agreement from this group or agreement from someone else?
you know, I was just looking at that and going, I don't remember what what's referring to. So, um,
Were you thinking maybe that it would get folded into an extension draft?
oh, yes. Yes. I think that was, yeah, that's where I was going was, depending on where the working group's going with, if we're doing a Skim v2 BIS or something like that, then there's no need for this to be a separate RFC. I would support rolling it in with an enhanced Skim draft. If we're just moving Skim as it is, 7644, if we're moving 7644 on to its next phase of formalization, then we couldn't really add this new feature in directly. It would have to remain an extension draft. So that's probably the biggest discussion is what's the process for moving this forward? Do we roll it into the core spec somehow because we're updating the core spec, or do we leave it as a separate enhancement?
So I may be hearing you volunteering to be an editor for the course spec as well, Phil. Just putting it out there.
I'll contribute this part.
Sounds good. I don't think we had volunteers for the course specs yet, so that's still under discussion. So Danny on the chat says he's interested in this work. So what we can do, Phil, is communicate over the mail list and check on interest on this body of work, and then also then discuss where we include this body of work. How's that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's another reason why I didn't want to do all the final security consideration stuff, because it really depends on where we roll it next. So, and I'm flexible as the author. I don't know if it's useful to just say, for the process wise for the group to adopt it, knowing that its final disposition is not known. But I'm wondering if it helps engage. I would like to see enough people show interest in it before we take it further, and be sure of that, which is the normal process. So,
Right. So,
so I can say my colleague at Oracle, Greg Wilson, who I was hoping could be here today, did say that Oracle intends to implement it shortly.
okay. I'm just writing down as an action item for myself to put that call for interest. Alrighty. Well, you guys are doing great and sticking to the time allocations. If there's no other comments or feedback, we can switch over to Danny. Thank you, Phil, and I'm glad that you're back with your mic and video.
Thanks.
Me too. I was not wanting to talk about that stuff.
You're interested?
I'm,
All right.
I'm interested, but I I haven't read the draft fully, so there's a strong difference between the two. Yeah, so I've written two different drafts. The drafts themselves are sort of rough. This is my first go around writing, internet draft, but there's some like problems or opportunities for betterment of the standard that I've seen working in the sort of the SaaS like Skim space, the cloud Skim space, that I thought could be solved with some fairly simple extensions to add new resources. Next slide, please. So the first draft is on a concept that I've tried to title verified domains. And in the cloud, there's a lot of different services, particularly like email providers, anything with like a hint of security to it. They like to require that ownership of a domain name, so at contoso.com, is verified before you can add it to your SaaS tenant. And that's to obviously prevent impersonation, that sort of thing. Like me as an individual, without proper proof, I shouldn't be able to go and register IETF.org with Google and set up mail for them. So obviously, there's other things, DNS, that stop a lot of those things, but like mail routing. But so the problem that comes into play here is when a Skim client is in the cloud world is trying to provision a large set of users to into the Skim service. So let's say it's an email provider or something of that sort, or any collaboration platform. The username in many cases ends up following that user@domain.com format. And what is currently undetectable based on the Skim standard is what format of name does the Skim service require? Because some just do a simple, it might be Danny, and some might be, Danny@domain.com. And so being able to determine that is helpful, but then also knowing for any instances where that user@domain.com format is being used, is the right-hand side of that, the domain.com part, is there some sort of verification mechanism in place? Because if there is, then what happens is if the client has data coming into it that doesn't align with what's allowed on the Skim service provider, the client will send requests that fail. If I try to create a user using a domain suffix that I have not proven ownership of in that collaboration platform, it will fail. And it's an unnecessary use of resources for both the client and the service provider, and it's something that's easily detectable and avoidable, or it should be. So the entire idea of this draft is to add a /verified domains endpoint so that any sort of Skim client interacting with the service provider can read the list of allowed domains, as well as some service provider config stuff, to see whether or not this whole draft has been implemented, and that will allow the client to act intelligently and avoid sending requests that will obviously fail. Next slide, please. So yeah, the two key components, we have the verified domains resource. I just mentioned that. So I've written this with it only being read-only, so only HTTP GET. There's some interest out there with parties that I've talked to about certain SaaS platforms having an option to trust domain verification from major IDPs that are connected to them. I left that completely to the side. I think that's probably a separate problem to be solved, or in an extension to an extension, or just a completely separate draft, because there's a lot of security considerations there. How do you stop a bad actor from trying to impersonate a trusted Skim client from the trusted from the perspective of the service provider? And I don't have the security background to write that. So, and then we have the service provider config extension just to advertise is it available, and a couple of key things of is this specific thing enabled or not. Next slide, please. So a quick run through the schema of the verified domain object. So we have domain name. It's fairly straightforward. It's a string containing at least the second level domain and top level domain. So that would be domain.com of the verified domain. Subdomains are supported as well. So that would be x.domain.com. And recursively, I think is the right word, down as well. So if you don't want a.b.domain.com, that would also be allowed. There's then a Boolean that says allow subdomains, which is to really just advertise actually about that piece that I was just talking about of subdomains. There are instances where there's a single organization may have many instances of a cloud platform in play. It may be split by region, by organization inside of the company. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can split up your user base, right? And so ownership of the top level domain, let's say domain.com, doesn't necessarily mean that all possible subdomains, infinitely under that, should be allowed as well. At least it should be an option to say, owning, having domain.com verified on your tenant does not allow you to also have, a.domain.com. It only gives you that top down, that top level or whatever is explicitly returned, rather than anything under it as well. That way, if you have, North America in one SaaS environment, Europe in another, APAC in another, they're all separated, and ownership of the top level domain doesn't, create problems if it doesn't actually grant the full set of subdomains under it. And then the last attribute in the schema, at least outside of some core attributes like ID, would be the verified date. This one's optional. It's an informational piece to know how long or when was the domain verified in this service. So yeah, for use cases where it's valuable. Next slide, please. Here's a quick run through of the service provider config. So there's a top level Boolean of just supported. Is the verified domains extension implemented? There's then a complex attribute of username properties, and it has two sub attributes. And I'm not sure if RFC 5321 is the right one to call. So anybody want to correct me, go for it. But one is to say, does the username follow that user@domain.com format? And then the second one is, if it accepts that domain.com format, or rather, if it requires that, is the domain suffix required to be verified? So this is to allow a Skim client to sort of programmatically or automatically figure out that it needs to act intelligently here, and that any possible value for username isn't acceptable. And then the last attribute in service provider config is emails verified domain required. And that's essentially the same as that second sub bullet point on username properties. The Skim standard says that, like 76, 43, and 44 already calls out that the emails .value attribute needs to be in that RFC 5321 format. So it didn't make sense to make it complex and have that advertised, because it should always be true. But yeah, those two are essentially to say, both for username and for emails, two separate attributes. Do these require that the domain suffix on the username or email value, do they need to be verified with the service provider? Next slide, please. So So here are some open questions. One I just mentioned, is 5321 the correct RC to point to for that format? I took a stab at it. I'm sure there'll be more revisions of this draft before we try to, if we ever try to move it towards adoption. If I'm wrong, please let me know. For the allow subdomains thing, is the purpose of it clear? Should that be moved to optional and then guidance provided specifying that the value, if not provided, is assumed to be true? So if you don't say that subdomains are not allowed, it's assumed that they are. I already sort of walked through the use case of that verbally. And then I had a little bit of trouble when I was writing the draft, trying to get like clear, concise language defining things like a domain. I think I used the term like DNS domain, something like that. Anybody who reviews this, if you have feedback on how I can make any of the wording clear, please, I would love to talk with you. Yeah, and that's I think about it for this draft. If you could move to the next slide, please. And if anybody has questions, at any time, just join the queue. Pam?
Pam just joined the queue. Go ahead, Pam.
Do you see a need for a use case where, in fact, the domain or the owner would want to define, say, 3 allowed subdomains? Because the Boolean in this case basically says all or none. Do you see a case where you would want to actually specify?
Yes, but I think that's achievable with the current draft. So the Boolean would be if I have I guess and maybe the wording in the draft needs to be refined, but the idea at least was that that it's to say, are subdomains of the values returned allowed? So if domain.com is what's returned, and all subdomains are not allowed, then you should only you would say allow subdomains false. And this is on a per resource return, so every domain returned would have its own value for allow subdomains. But so the service provider, sorry, go ahead. The service provider could alternatively just return the 3 subdomains. So if it was a.domain.com, b.domain, c.domain, it could return the 3 subdomains and explicitly just state these are the subdomains that are allowed.
So essentially what that does is allows or prevents cascading subdomain assumptions, right? Okay, yeah. I get it. Thank you.
Yeah, so if it's everything, you can just do like domain.com and say allow subdomains and they get everything underneath. If it's specific subdomains, then rather than listing the top level domain.com, you can just list or return back the subdomain dot top dot whatever.com in a list of whatever the allowed ones are. Okay. And so yeah, the second draft sort of aims to solve that same general like SaaS-y problem of clients interacting with Skim service providers want to know, they want to be able to act intelligently and not waste time calculating requests that are going to fail. And so the discoverability of information relevant to whether or not a request fails is important in my opinion. And so in this case, I wrote a draft jointly covering adding 2 new resources for roles and entitlements. And these are meant to mirror acceptable values for the user resource object for the roles and entitlements attributes in the core schema. So discovery of the acceptable values allows us to not send, as the client, it allows the client to not send an invalid request. And by pulling that list back, you can know, okay, these are the accepted values, anything else won't work. And then the ability to discover roles and entitlements and what values are allowed. Because this draft is going to go into returning them as complex objects, so both value and display. It also then gives the clients a little more flexibility in helping the like whoever's configuring it to assign the roles or entitlements inside of the client so that they can get the correct values on the correct objects in the service provider. So the end state of that being a client could go and read, they could do a get on just the base of /roles or /entitlements, get a full list of the available values back, and then represent them in a UI somewhere and allow them to be assigned to other resources as appropriate. Just so there could be a direct mapping of these objects get this role or whatnot. Next slide, please. So the key components, /roles, /entitlements, and a service provider config to announce what is available. Next slide, please. The schema, I designed it to mostly mimic the sub-attributes of the user resources, like roles or entitlements attributes. So for both roles and entitlements, since they share the same complex sub-attributes, the resources proposed here would have value, display, and type, which all originate from the sub-attributes on the user object, as well as one new attribute specific to this draft, which is enabled, which allows the service provider to announce that this role or entitlement exists, but is not currently in a state that can be used. Next slide, please. So here is an example of service provider config. This is mirrored for entitlements, so you can just sort of replace all for the word roles with entitlements, and I think it applies. So it's a complex value for for roles inside of the service provider config. Enabled is this feature added. So we have an enabled for roles and enabled for entitlements. Are multiple roles supported? Some service providers only allow a single value for roles, whereas some allow multiple. So since the standard today doesn't have an easy way to determine that I'm aware of, why not include it here? And then additional just advertisement of what does the service provider support. The 7643 says that these sub-attributes on roles are optional. So primary and type, we're allowing the service provider to advertise whether or not they support them. And all this is just sort of adding discoverability around these for the client to know how best to interact with the service provider. That way, if they don't support type or they don't support primary, there's no sense in calculating them and including them in the request. Next slide, please. So open questions on these. How widely adopted is the type sub-attribute for roles and entitlements? In my own experience, which is only one person, I've seen implementation of primary, of value, and of display. I'm not sure if I've seen implementation of type used for roles or entitlements. So I'm very curious just on what implementations are out there. And this raises questions. Should type be considered, like if we were to include discoverability of available types, because the 7643 does not list any canonical values for type for roles or entitlements. Should type be advertised, should the values that are allowed for type be advertised at sort of a global level, so perhaps in service provider config, or should the available types be advertised on a per role or entitlement value level? And then adding just sort of extra questions here, even though they're not all relevant to this draft specifically. Has there been any implementation of type for roles or entitlements? Should it remain in the core schema doc if, and this goes back to the question that Phil had raised earlier, if we're just sort of, giving a once over on 76, 42, 43, 44, and sort of trying to push it forward to a real standard versus proposed, then we probably can't make that change. But if we're going towards a new RFC with some major changes, that sort of thing, I think it's a worthwhile question of, has there been any implementation of this, and like, is there a value in it being there? And then there's a question that I now have floating around based on a previous conversation I had with Phil. Should this be a standalone extension or get merged into the core schema docs? This again falls to, are we just tidying up the existing ones, or going hard on making a new one? I think from sort of an ease of like access thing and the timelines of how soon can we improve this, the standalone draft makes sense in my opinion, and potentially it could always be obsoleted later and moved into if we have a new RFC for Skim 3.0 or whatever, it could be obsoleted and moved into it then. But I'm interested to hear any other perspectives as well. I believe that is the last slide.
It is. So we have time for one question. No comments or feedback? Right. I'm glad you put the question at the end, Danny, because that's what I was going to ask. So it seems, again, much to what we did with Phil's draft, what we can do is on the mail list, ask for interest on the actual topics of the two drafts before we can sort out whether they become standalone drafts or they become part of the core schema, right?
Okay, well, without any questions, I believe it's back to you, Nancy.
Yes, I'm just making notes for myself. All right. Thank you, Danny. All right, so we're back to procedural stuff. Let me worry there for a moment. All right, so thank you everyone for putting forward draft proposed concepts, I will say. So with that in mind, we talked about putting proposals together that can serve as documents that we can adopt to move forward. So there was a question on the list about how we could move forward with some of the tools. We talked about it at the virtual interim informal session a couple of weeks ago. And I brought up the notion of using GitHub. A lot of the working groups at the IETF use that as a way of openly sharing the work that the working group, the documents that the working group is focused on. It also allows us to have that version control, but more importantly for myself and the authors and editors of the drafts is that we can interactively and at live do the issue tracking suggestions and pull requests, if you will. The IETF has provided guidance. I've put the link in here, RFC 8874. There's a tutorial there as well. And so as chairs, what we can do is provide a Skim working group repository there. Typically what we do there, though, is that we only include the documents that are adopted, not the ones that are proposed. Potentially, I could create a subrepo that are for proposed, but I wanted to bring that up to you guys as we work through consensus. So my proposal is going to be that we use GitHub. The other comment I wanted to make here is for communication channels, and that was the other thing that we discussed. And I was going to note details here in Slack, but as it turns out, the IETF doesn't really have an official account for Slack that we could use, so we'd have to ask the question there. for a more interactive communication style there. So that said, independent of the interactive communication channel, that being Slack, we officially will run, we meaning the chairs, will officially run the consensus calls, if you will, through the Skim mail list. So I still encourage everyone to use that mail list for any issues, questions, topics that we want to raise, and also pay attention there, as whatever decisions we may make, even in these plenary sessions, they will get confirmed on the mail list. So I will give a minute or two to see if there are any comments or feedback. First on the GitHub. You guys are very quiet. Danny.
Not GitHub. Would it just be like people submit drafts to the IETF, or is it all just like decentralized?
Well, you still have to submit the working group. Well, all the drafts, whether proposal or working groups, they do have to be submitted through the IETF process. But as you're working on the drafts, and as we provide comments and create issues that we want to address in the drafts, those we can track through GitHub. So the IETF does have an issue tracker, but I think most everyone today uses other mechanisms. In the other working groups that I chair, we use GitHub, and that's where we track the issues, a combination of the GitHub as well as on the mail list. So what I'm doing right now, as I'm seeing people put votes on the chat, I've put, so on the Meet Echo, you'll see I've started a poll to see if we can get consensus on using GitHub as our repo. So there's a raise your hand for yes, don't raise your hand for no. Oh, I have. All right, I think we have unanimous consensus. I'll give it 10 more seconds. So Danny, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it was already clear that the like final steps would be submitting, but it's more like it answered the question. I was more talking just about the like before they're fully baked, like collaborative review, and
Yes.
this sounds like it's a way to have a decentralized or a more centralized way to collect all these drafts before they're fully baked.
Correct. Yeah. And thank you, Roman. He put in the link. Oh, go ahead, Barry.
I just said that when you use when a working group uses GitHub, it also has to figure out what the pace for posting internet drafts to the data tracker is. And so you use GitHub for the development of the document, but still periodically post drafts throughout the process when you get to a point where you think it's solid enough that a wider community might want to be looking at it.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so we seem to have unanimous consensus. Everybody has voted for GitHub. So thank you, everyone, for that. Come back to, no, I didn't want to stop. Okay, so coming back. Okay, so we've already put the question for the repo. So I'll go ahead and create the GitHub whenever I can get my laptop back and running. The second question is, prior to us becoming a working group, thank you, Pam, for running the biweekly informal meetings, and I would still encourage that. Now it gets to the question of whether, as a working group, we want to have virtual interims at all. And if we do, whether we want to run them informally, meaning as we need it, or whether we want to run it to a cadence of either every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks. So while I create the poll, if anybody has comments or feedback, please do so now. Okay, I've done the poll before, but I thought I could do multiple choice. So I guess we'll first ask the question. Go ahead, Pam. I can't change the question. So the first question is whether we want to continue.
I'm trying to scribe the question too, so I'm sorry. I think I would love to see us do virtuals just because it helps us get everybody's point of view into the doc, and I think it also just raises engagement.
Okay. Yeah, so far I've got 8 people responding to the poll positively to yes, we want to continue with virtual interims. And so my next question, rather than me having a poll, since I can't do multiple, does the group feel, so honestly, from my being chair perspective, I could probably commit to doing them on a monthly cadence, but want to hear feedback as to whether there would be objections to monthly. Pam, I didn't take you off the queue, so don't know if you have.
I think that's fine. +1 for
Okay.
me. And I'm really glad that you can run them. I think it's better for the official chair to run them for sure.
I don't know about that, Pam, but thank you.
Also, I'm going to add my vote to the last poll because I had to dismiss it to get on to unmute my mic, so I couldn't respond.
Oh, okay. That's all right. I mean, we've got, you know, a good amount of interest there. So rather than me running a poll, I'll just have people speak up if there are any objections for us to start running a monthly cadence. And I can do a doodle poll to see times for those as well. Okay, this actually went faster than I thought it would. Are there any other orders of business that we need to discuss? We actually have 2 minutes left. Okay, so I will raise one. Janelle and Danny talked about the paper cuts and the things that we want to address as we evolve the use. We've already covered the use cases, the schema and the protocol. And Danny and Phil, you provided some of the work that you'd like to see get addressed. Can I get someone, I mean, Phil, I was kind of volunteering you to take the pen on a proposal, but perhaps I'll take it up to the working group mail list as well. It would be good if we can start discussing the content, which we have a start of, but also getting volunteers to take the pen, basically to be editors for these drafts. Thanks, Danny. So are you volunteering for both the scheme and the protocol?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. All right. All right, Danny and Janelle. Thank you for that. Anything else that we need to cover? Pam, thank you so much for being our note taker. I think we are now out of time. I thank you, everyone. Let's continue the dialogue. Sorry, go ahead.
Nope, just was also going to say thanks, everybody.
Ah, yes. And I'll probably start a doodle poll to find a day and time, recurring day and time in which we can do the virtual. Oh, and thank you, Paul, as well.
I just wanted to jump in here to congratulate everyone on a successful launch here. I think we had a smooth charting process. I appreciate kind of everyone's kind of feedback, and big thank you to Barry and Nancy kind of with their leadership to get us here to our first working group meeting. And it sounds like we have a good plan to kick off the work.
Excellent. Thank you, Roman. Thank you, everyone. Until our next session. Bye, everyone.